I don't know how you feel about wrestling, or wrestling as we call it in these parts. I grew up watching live Atlanta wrestling on Saturday nights with my grandfather. He got a huge kick out of the whole thing. Afterwards, grandmother would come into the room and we'd all watch Lawrence Welk together. Granddaddy loved the wrestling best, though. He'd tell me the legends of Man Mountain Dean and Haystack Calhoun. I was about 6, and I took my wrestling with absolutely no grains of salt. I couldn't figure out how Tarzan White, Chief Bigheart, or the Assassin could be back for another night in the ring. I mean, we clearly saw them break their jaws and several limbs last week. I guess there's something comforting about watching big men pretend they're fighting when we know that in my life and your life, punches aren't pulled, falls aren't faked. I'm talking about the real showdown, the basic struggles that define life. We all spend our lives wrestling in various ways and against various opponents, and none of us face exactly the same foes in exactly the same rings. My wrestling matches are likely to be very different than yours. Here's a list of a few of the classic ones. Which ones have been the big fights of your life? Which are you still on the mat with? Once you've answered that question, once you've identified the biggest struggle you're facing right now, keep it at the forefront of your mind. In this lesson, we're going to go into the ring together, and we'll explore one of the Bible's most fascinating characters, someone who is known for many things, but most of all, for wrestling.
Wait a minute! Wait a minute! Michael said he got it! He got all of it! Michael's got all of it! Michael's gonna cover! One, two!
The life of Jacob is a storyteller's dream, almost as if God handcrafted it for Sunday school teachers. It even comes in handy, class-sized episodes. The problem is, I've never found it possible to tell just one of these stories of Jacob without being able to get into the others. Everything interconnects in his life. Much of what he does today is a reaction to the mess he made yesterday. Just like you and me, I'm afraid. For example, tell the story of Jacob and you have to mention he was born just a moment after his twin brother, entering this world with a grip on Esau's ankle. Esau barely got there first, so he was the heir, the one who would get the all-important blessing. Then, of course, people want to hear about the time Jacob talked Esau into trading that birthright for a bowl of stew. Or, how about just after that, when he and his mom deceived old blind Isaac, the dad, into blessing him instead of Esau? Great story. Jacob is a classic trickster, a character you find throughout literature. He came into the world grabbing and he just couldn't stop. His name translated to heel catcher or supplanter. Either one fits. He could never quite, get a grip. Jacob played a lot of tricks, but somehow it always came around to him being the butt of his own jokes. For example, once he had the birthright and the blessing, what was any of it worth? He had to flee for his life. He couldn't enjoy any of the things he was going to inherit. Esau, the supplanted one, was looking for blood, and Jacob had to run to Uncle Laban from his mother's side of the family to just be safe. And it was on his way there that he had an experience that would have changed anyone's life.
Look at the stare of the champion against the challenger. The irresistible force meeting the immovable object.
Leaving home for the first time is frightening, but imagine you've been as pampered as Jacob seems to have been. Imagine wondering if a murderous brother is coming after you. It was Jacob's first real crisis. He had really messed up, and now, alone with his scrambled thoughts, he stops for the night, lays his head down on a stone, and suddenly, as he drifts off to sleep, he sees an incredible vision. What he sees is usually described as a stairway, or in that song, Jacob's Ladder. Artists usually portray it this way, or this way, but the word for it is found only this one time in the Old Testament. It's a lost word that seems to translate as heaped up, and what's described is a familiar religious image in ancient Mesopotamia, a ziggurat, which is a heaped up series of steps that form a temple, and it looked like this. Remember, we're 28 chapters into the Bible. No Moses yet, no 10 Commandments. All that was known about God was that he had revealed himself to Abraham, and then to Isaac, Jacob's father. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have been familiar with idols and pagan gods. It's not surprising God chose this image to speak to Jacob. Jacob saw angels ascending and descending, and God either above him or even beside him, depending on how this ancient language is translated. What's important is that God is speaking to Jacob just as he spoke to his father and to his father before him. Each generation must have its own personal experience with God. You can inherit all kinds of things from family, but intimacy with God can't be passed on. We have to find it for ourselves in our own way. Jacob has heard about this God, but he's never heard from him. And he must have wondered, is it all real? Nobody but our family trusts this God. Now, as Jacob lies beneath the stars and sees this spectacle, it's all real. The God of Abraham and Isaac has become the God of Jacob too. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. Jacob says to himself, surely the Lord was in this place and I didn't know it. Have you ever had that feeling? Remember, he lived in an ancient world in which gods were territorial. They stayed within their county lines, like sheriffs in the sky, and they often tended to crops or warfare. Jacob discovered he might be running away from a lot of things and people, but not the Lord. He rose the next morning and made God a promise, as people do when they're filled with inspiration. The rock that was his pillow became an altar, and the place became Bethel, as he named it, meaning house of God, and he finished his journey to a new life.
He is showing his resilience.
I bet you know this part of the story. Think about this. Jacob wrestled with God. He saw a fantastic stairway to heaven with angels going up and down as if they were on escalators at the mall. But with all of that, what people remember most about Jacob's life is how messed up his love life was. You'll recall Jacob met Rachel, Laban's beautiful daughter. He fell in love, and soon he was asking Laban for her hand. The deal was she could be his for 7 years of field work. Now Rebekah, Jacob's mom, expected her son to come home soon after things cooled down with Esau, but Jacob had forgotten everything else but this lovely girl. Jacob put in his 7 sweaty years. He had the big party, and the bride was sent into his tent once it was dark, according to tradition, and when the morning light fell, he found himself lying not beside Rachel, but Leah, her sister. The scammer had been scammed. Jacob had entered the world grabbing someone else's heel. Now he'd had his leg pulled. At this point, Jacob could have done many things, including taking his unwanted bride and going home. Instead, he worked out the same 7-year deal, and this time he dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, and made sure the lights were on in the tent when they sent in the bride. As it all worked out, he had 14 years of work, 2 brides to show for it, Rachel and Leah, and quite a thriving business of his own by this time. But now he began thinking of home. Thomas Wolfe said you can't go home again. Could Jacob be the exception? Over the years, Jacob must have wondered about his mother, whether Isaac, his father, was still alive, and in particular, Esau, his twin. Was Esau still angry? These weren't times when you could send him a text and say, "Bro, are we cool?" You couldn't sneak a peek at his Facebook page. Physical distance was a complete barrier to communication. Perhaps time had healed all wounds, but who could know? Jacob was about to find out. He had a large family by now and a land and a legacy to claim. It was time. Well, there were more shenanigans between Jacob and Laban. It's complicated. You're welcome to read up on that part on your own. You'll find it in Genesis 31. Bottom line, Jacob pulled another fast one. They worked it out, but once again it was time for Jacob to renew his passport. He left, as always, with a mess behind him and a mystery ahead of him, which is a pretty good definition of the process of living. The closer he and his caravan got to home, the more nervous Jacob became. He sent messengers ahead to Esau with extravagant gifts and a warm, conciliatory message. What he heard back was that Esau was heading this way with 400 men. Kind of ambiguous. That could be good or bad. Jacob split his families, servants, and cattle into two large groups, so that if one group was destroyed, the other at least would survive. And he was left by himself to think and to pray. It would have been another good time to see a flight of stairs with flights of angels. But that's not what happened. Instead, he found himself attacked in the darkness by a stranger. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." We have a lot of questions about this surrealistic scene, one of the strangest in all of the Bible. With whom was Jacob fighting exactly? He's described as a man 3 times, but when he leaves, Jacob suggests he has seen God face to face. Several Old Testament stories blur the line this way between God and his messengers, called angels. The more important question is, why did this happen? Wrestling with an angel? What's that all about? We're left in the dark to wrestle with that question ourselves. Ultimately, the story simply rings true. Jacob is at the very crossroads of his life. Again, we've all wrestled through the night in that situation, for career, for family questions, for health concerns, for whatever you see on this list, and many things you don't. As a young man, God gave Jacob a stairway. He showed his own glory, and that was enough. These many years later, more is expected of Jacob. He has to tussle with God a little. That's how real wisdom and strength come about in life. We fight for it. When life presses in on us, what we want from God is the stairway. What we need is the struggle. Maybe that's what Paul the Apostle means when he says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." The challenge isn't there to knock you down. It's to help you learn to stand. Jacob accepted the challenge. He'd always been a grabber, but it was time to come to grips with the destiny God had set out for him. So he told his opponent he wasn't stopping until he had a blessing. Now, what if you or I said that the next time life got a good hammerlock on us? What if we said, "I'm going to fight back and I won't stop until God blesses me"? Jacob did that. And what was the blessing? A name change. Big deal, right? For the ancients, a name change meant a reboot, a whole new script. He became Israel, and the chosen nation would be named after him. Not after Abraham, not after Isaac, or even the golden boy Joseph, Jacob's son. The new name carried the meaning, as the angel says, of striving with God and humanity, and prevailing. In case you're wondering, the reunion with Esau went very well. We get the idea that Jacob's battle was never really with his brother, but with the unsatisfied, striving man whose weary reflection confronted him every morning. The course of Jacob is the path set out for all of us. To live in this world is to wrestle with God, to wrestle with each other, with unforeseeable struggles in the dark. And the trick is to keep up the fight until you have a blessing. Now, what are you striving with at present? What is someone you care about striving with? My prayer for all of us is to get a grip. Strive with God like a warrior, in the power and grace of God, for God, and He just may change your whole destiny. Thanks for listening.